Okay, go ahead and started our webinar. We're going to allow a couple of minutes for people to arrive, and while we wait, Dr. Neumann, hello, is going to grace us with some music. There's a URL that's in the chat and on the screen of some background information that's been sent out as well. So take it away, Peter.
A little ragged, but that's the way it goes.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. One of the purposes of BCI is to share information and really help advance cybersecurity. And I'm very excited about this webinar series and very excited about the talk today. I have followed loosely electronic voting for many years, and it's one of the more interesting security problems because it really has these two diametrically opposed objectives where you want every vote to be absolutely tabulated, and yet at the same time you want to allow people to be anonymous. And those conflicting goals make the problem set, I think, really interesting. So I'd like to thank our sponsors and speakers and our volunteers for putting this all together, and introduce our two expert panelists, expert fireside chatters, Dr. Rebecca Mercuri and Dr. Peter Neumann, who have both been involved in this field for many, many years and had published and have presented in front of Congress and done expert testimony. And so with that, I want to keep it short to give you guys more time. I'll hand it over to Rebecca.
Okay.
Okay, Rebecca, you
should be able to share. Okay, yes. 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 Are you able to see?
Yes, we can see your screen.
You can see my screen. Okay, great.
In the background.
What?
Somebody's speaking in the background, but you want to get the audience to mute. Thank you.
That's good. Okay, great. Well, I wanted to thank Diana and Mark for the opportunity to give this webinar briefing with Peter Neumann to the Base Security Institute. And let me just skip ahead on slides here. I would be really remiss to not mention the demonstrations and things that have been going on and are going on right now globally in memory and solidarity with George Floyd. These are auspicious times. Back in 1966, Vernon Dahmer, a powerful voting advocate, was murdered in the firebombing of his home by the KKK. He gave us the slogan, which was actually even used in the Obama campaign: if you don't vote, you don't count. What Peter and I have to tell you about the state of elections today is very dismaying. but please, we hope that our comments and the present situation will not keep you from voting. Voting is an important vehicle for change. So US elections are at risk, but they've been at risk for a very long time. They are large stakes, adversarial processes that occur in a short, identifiable time frame, hence because they're identifiable, very easy to target by computers. You can put a microprocessor in 5, 8 years earlier, but it knows the dates of the general elections because those are predictable by the US Constitution. So they're high-risk targets where corruption is difficult to detect. And as Diana mentioned, the anonymity requirement for voting prevents the use of traditional forms of auditing. That actually was a major finding in my doctoral dissertation, which was defended 11 days before the Bush versus Gore election in 2000. Earlier forms of fraud, which are still possible, typically required insider access and collusion. But computers and the internet now provide, a whole host of opportunities for covert attacks over all aspects of the election. And now, as we've been seeing, especially in 2016, that AI is becoming an important tool in the election subversion arsenal. So here was before COVID-19. There wasn't any social distancing. You weren't even required to wear pants. There was basically, you come in, they would give you your voting paper and you would stand there and fill it out. Now everybody has to be separated. If we're going to observe that in November, there's a lot of other restrictions that would have to occur. But they also had, and they still do, you'll see in some maps I'm going to show you, these touch screens, and they're still around despite Peter and I trying to clamor about them for decades now. But now they're considered icky. Nobody wants to be touching a touch screen with your bare hands. The last person who used it could have had COVID. So we're very concerned about this now. We should have been concerned about it for other reasons before. That lower photo is of the new voting machines in Philadelphia. These are not really tremendously user-friendly. I mean, the gaming machines down at the casinos are more user-friendly than this voting machine. Also, the vendor ES&S was fined nearly $3 million for illegal lobbying during the procurement process, but they still went ahead with the rest of the procurement anyway, and they were planned to be used at the primary yesterday. I still have to consult with people in Pennsylvania to find out exactly what happened, but they were mailing out absentee ballots to many, many people in Pennsylvania. Many other new COVID-unfriendly touchscreen voting machines were planned to be rolled out all around the United States this year, including in Los Angeles. But it's unclear whether any of these will be deemed usable for November under the present circumstances. There we go. So voting after COVID-19, you might remember this situation of the hours-long voting lines at the polls in Wisconsin on April 7th. What you might not remember is that they actually shut down many of the polls. So of course the lines are going to be longer. And in fact, polling places have been getting reduced in numbers, sometimes strategically, or it seems to be, but basically it's just taking longer and longer to vote at the polls even before COVID-19. Basically what we're seeing is a increased number of people who want to be voting by absentee. There's an example of collection of absentee ballots there. And, that's the direction that things seem to be going on. Polling places themselves are risk targets. What we don't ordinarily think of course, that wasn't a picture of a polling place. That's from the recent situations. But while we don't ordinarily see polling places burned down in the USA, that does occur in other countries, especially in India, to keep people from voting. They might even do it later in the day when voting information has been collected so that it's all destroyed. This was an earlier march that was captured in September 2018, where someone's holding up an important sign: voter suppression is un-American. Well, it actually is American. It was illegal for the majority of the population at the very outset of the United States by the enactment of various articles of the Constitution, and various rules and laws continue to disenfranchise large numbers of citizens. So between Peter and myself, we've been advocating for paper ballots for over 60 years, not consecutively, but collectively. Finally, after the Russians were blamed for hacking our vulnerable election systems, it looked like paper was going to become the gold standard for the 2020 elections. But unfortunately, this appears to have all been a ruse. Those in charge of the elections and those that are advising them do not want the paper ballots to be considered as the official record of the election. Notice that in our construing of the use of paper ballots, the paper record is the official vote. But that's why you hear these referred to as voter verifiable. Well, maybe you verified them, maybe you didn't. Or they sometimes refer to them as audit trails, like we're going to be auditing them, but we're not going to be counting them. So those words are not, those are not just ploy words. They're said deliberately, and some of them have gotten, those phrases have gotten into the state laws. Some states, including Florida, Michigan, and even an Orange County, California judge have deemed that a full recount from the paper is illegal. That would be illegal in those states where they declared those types of things. So it's a big problem. You know, we may not be able to count them even if we have the paper. What's the point of the paper? And that's one thing that we're very concerned about. So back in 2016, at the last election, these were the paperless voting machines that were slated for replacement. Notice that, you know, they're sort of all clustered in this sort of southern and southwestern area of the United States. I don't think that's necessarily an accident. The yellow ones are the ones that are not going to be replaced, at least not entirely, by 2020. The blue ones are the ones where they did successfully replace the paperless voting machines, and the light blue ones are sort of half and half, or they were in process. So that's the situation as it stood before COVID. So now let's talk about absentee ballots. So you keep hearing the word mail-in ballots or vote by mail ballots, but they're not really in all states required to be deposited into the mail. And I want people to refer to them as absentee ballots. I'm trying to be very careful to use the word absentee ballots all the time when I talk about them. Sometimes they slip up, but they are voter verified paper ballots. It's just for a person who is not capable of being at the polls, does not want to be at the polls for whatever reason, might be out of state or whatever. And the different states have different laws and regulations that indicate when you're allowed to get one of these absentee ballots for individual elections, or in some states you can just register, as I am, a permanent absentee, and then you'll always get your ballot mailed to you. And then you could either, again, in most states, they have a way of dropping them off. So there should be a way to deliver them in person. Places are expanding that, and you don't necessarily have to mail them. I think that mailing them in is problematic, and so I really have never mailed them in. I always fill mine out and then take it to one of the drop-off locations. Some of the states provide additional security checks for the hand-delivered ballots, which could be a problem, like let's say you don't have your driver's license with you or whatever, but they don't have those security checks for the ones that are mailed in. So I don't understand why they make it any different, but at least I feel like I know how I voted. I put it in the envelope, I signed the outside of the envelope, and I'm taking it and I drop it off in New Jersey, or at least in Mercer County, New Jersey. They will stamp it with a time stamp. I do sign a sheet. So it should be in there. You can also, you know, do some things to the ballot that would not identify yourself, like don't put little stars or asterisks or whatever on it, because that could void your ballot. But you could, for like a write-in, you could actually, you know, put in Mickey Mouse or, you know, whatever. And then that is a way of determining that, you know, you could see that later. But that also would maybe void your anonymity. So I'm not suggesting that you do that, but you can find out in the records, you can see that your vote was actually received and that you did vote in that election. So that would be sometime later down the road if you wanted to check. Some states also limit the number of ballots for which a particular individual provides assistance in preparing, mailing, or hand delivering ballots in order to discourage what has recently been called vote harvesting. And that was something that had been going on. It is possible for people in a nursing home to get absentee ballots, and but they would have to sign. Many people who are deemed to be incapacitated to the point that maybe they have a mental disorder, they will be ruled by the judge as not being allowed to vote anymore for that particular instance because they could be taken advantage of. So absentee ballots can be good. And I think that that's really the way to go. As I say, I've been voting that way ever since Mercer County got their electronic voting machines back in the late 2000s. I guess it was around 2008, around that time. Okay, so what problems do we have with paper ballots? Well, in the places where we have problems with all sorts of ballots, we have these same problems with paper ballots. So we had problems with the hanging chad, and we had problems with the butterfly ballots, especially in Florida. So in 2018, I was contacted by 60 Minutes, who sent me this picture of a ballot that was used in the areas of Broward, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, Volusia, the same counties, as it turned out, that used the butterfly ballot format that was so confusing in 1988 and 2000. So if you look at this ballot, it doesn't look very confusing. Down the left-hand side, you'll see that there's this whole area. Let me see if I can get a pointer over there. You can see this whole area where there's instructions. Now, we also refer to the highest races like the president, the Senate race, U.S. Senate, U.S. House of Representatives. We call that the top of the ballot. It's usually at the top of the ballot. But no, in those counties in Florida, they put them over here underneath the instructions. And so a lot of people miss them. I know how you could miss voting for your top of the ballot races. Like, whoa, what happened to governor? What happened to, my House of Representatives race? It's buried down there. But if you quickly went through, boom, 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 you missed it. You didn't notice when you were reviewing your ballot, and they did notice there were a lot that left that blank. That would generally not be intentional in large quantities. So the butterfly ballot layout was bad, and this layout is bad, but states continue to have considerable leeway in the manner in which their ballots are prepared. And the question is why? Why haven't we legislated better regulations? We can get into that maybe during the Q&A period, but you should think about that. So one of the other issues that we have is secret counting. Now, going back into the days of, Boss Tweed, we had this cartoon, very famous, in counting there is strength. And has long been known the results of any ballot counting that is done in secret, whether it be secretly inside of a computer or secretly by Boss Tweed and his goons, any of those results should be considered to be dubious. But secret counting is usually the methodology that is used for counting the elections. We'll get back to that as we go along here. So then we have the question of election fraud. So this was from 2016. Donald Trump was still saying the same thing he's saying now. In addition to winning the electoral college in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. So this is definitely known to be, and now flagged by Twitter in the new versions of this, that these are overinflated estimates that have not been confirmed and are a smokescreen for other misdeeds. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't ever happen, that no people ever voted illegally, but there's two different types of illegal things that happen. There's voter fraud and there's election fraud. Voter fraud is ballots. This was a meme that somebody put up from a prior talk that I gave. Voter fraud is ballots cast by ineligible voters. As I said, there's not much of that really goes on. But election fraud, there is tons of that goes on, or there's, let's say, there's a lot of different possibilities that we don't really know how much of it goes on, but we know there are a lot of different ways that you can conduct election fraud. So voter fraud is people who are not supposed to be voting who did, or people who voted for other people illegally, or stuff like that. Election fraud is hacking, rigging, denial of service, all sorts of other things that you can do. So just keep that in mind, that that's two different types of things. So now getting back to Boss Tweed, so we have this ballot box. The ballot box is sort of sacrosanct. So it's supposed to be sealed, but sometimes the seals aren't put on it. But the point is that I call it the Pandora box, like Pandora's box. As soon as we open the box, all sorts of problems can arise. So it creates opportunities for altering ballots, removing ballots, substituting ballots. It creates chain of custody issues, precinct counts, central counts. Where do we count these ballots that are in there? If we scan them, what happens to the paper? All of this sort of stuff. So all of these questions I call Pandora problems, and we'll talk about that further as well. But one of the solutions that's been proposed by a number of mathematicians, computer scientists, and also statisticians is the concept of risk limiting audits, referred to as RLA. And basically what it is that they take a percentage. You look at the totals. So you say, okay, this race was not very close, so we're not going to have to count a lot of ballots to see if it was okay or not. This one is very close, so we may have to really check to make sure that we're within that margin of error of, you know, which person won or not. So that's what the risk limiting audits are supposed to do in a nutshell. There's a lot of things about them. I'm going to show you a little bit about it, but I'm running through it really quickly. So as for time, but you can read all about it, and we have plenty of references as well. But what's wrong with them? What's wrong with them, as you'll see as I go quickly through the next slides, is that all election administrators, and I'm saying all. Now, maybe there might be one or two election administrators in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and perhaps in Silicon Valley that are not clueless about this math. But I know that of the election administrators, including state level ones, they have no idea how to determine the math for the risk limiting audits. And so these tallies could be rigged to look like it's a larger margin between candidates. So remember, if it's a wide margin, you don't need to count very many ballots. So only a few ballots will be counted, and then it's not going to be detected. And another thing about this is that this method, the RLAs, is better able to detect clumpy fraud, like a lot of fraud, a lot of change votes in a few precincts, as opposed to dispersed fraud. Few votes here, few votes there, not going to get picked up, hardly ever going to get picked up by the risk limiting audit. So in my opinion, the intention of RLA is to avoid ever counting the full set of paper ballots. And in fact, as I said, it may be illegal to count them in Florida, Michigan, and California, and maybe some other states as well. Okay, so now, why would we care about RLAs? Well, some states, actually quite a few states, were concerned that, okay, we're going to these paper ballots. Notice again, now these are the ones on the west. We're going to the paper ballots north. You know, these are states that really didn't have much in the way of the electronic voting now. So they're got the paper and they're concerned. They want to make sure that the paper is audited correctly. So they're required, they put this into their laws, that they're required to do a post-election audit before the vote is certified, usually by the state. It's certified usually by the Secretary of State in the 2020 elections. So, but they didn't specify how to do the post-election audit. So is it up to the cities? Is it up to the state? Is it up to the counties? And again, that differs from state to state. So based on that, all these people are scrambling. Oh, now we got to figure out how to do a post-election audit. Here comes all these mathematicians, gurus saying, oh, but you can do a risk limiting audit. So a couple of states, a few of them said, all right, let's experiment with them. So these are the ones that are toying with it. Only the dark blue ones, which is Colorado and what is that, Rhode Island. Those are the only two that are mandating the use of the risk limiting audits in the 2020 election cycle. But everybody else, no. So, you know, we don't know how they're going to do their audits because, again, they're required to do audits. So here's, again, just a overview of the risk limiting audits. You conduct the election. You have to store, organize, and catalog the paper ballots. Then you have to identify which contests you're going to audit. And they select a random sample of ballots. You pull the sampled ballots out. You check them. You see whether there's always a scientific and math sort of involved in all these steps. You check this and see whether you have to keep counting. If you have to keep counting, then you're not ready. You got to keep going back, select more, you're stuck in this loop. And if your math says, okay, you're done, we believe your data, then okay, you're good to go. Okay, so here's what it looks like. I call this magic math and 10-sided dice. The magic math part you'll see on the next slide. So here's the separating out into groups, okay? So you've got to go through, separate all the ballots for the election into these groups. Now, this could just be maybe a town, you know, that's a small number. The ones that have tried this, that are experimenting with it, and they've done it for a whole county, it feels like an entire gymnasium. It's huge. So, and then, because we don't trust computers, we trust computers to collect the votes and maybe count these ballots, you know, so that we can determine the disparity. But we don't trust them enough to give us a random number, because we know that computers are notoriously bad at generating real random numbers. So we use the Dungeon and Dragon dice to generate a random seed for selection. Well, I can tell you, you can buy these at any toy store, and I have plenty of these 10-sided dice. So, you know, hey, I could just substitute a few and sort of, you know, weight the random choice in my direction. Because of this, the results of the audit are not available for days after the election. They're going to say, okay, here's the winners, but then they're going to be doing this auditing, and it might take days and days and days. And here's the magic math. The magic math part, if you took even any statistics class, you recognize this as a statistics type of formula, and in fact it is. So we're looking at thresholds, statistical thresholds. And again, does anyone in election administration know what an actual log is? I dare say not. But in any event, that's one of numerous formulas that are used for this type of risk limiting audit. And here is the part that I really want you to pay attention to. This is a plot of the sample sizes that are needed. How many votes do you actually count, depending on the disparity and how many people voted? So what's scary to me is here's between 64,000 and 128,000 people voted, but they're saying based on certain, you know, data that we got in the race, all we have to check is 8 ballots. Excuse me, 8 ballots? If you consider a precinct usually about 1,000 persons, that would be like 100 precincts. So 100 precincts, we're only going to pull out 8 ballots, and then we're going to consider that a statistically significant sample and make our adjudication that way. No, this is not good. And so this is why, among these other reasons, why I'm concerned about doing the risk limiting audit. What I think we should be doing is public counting. We have the ability to do public counting. We don't put numbers on the ballots because, again, that could violate privacy. But we could put barcodes on them. These aren't, you know, they're not secure. QR codes are not secure. People have suggested that. I think that they are using QR codes in Los Angeles, at least if they use the machines they had. But it would be a way to scan them in. People could be using an opaque projector. You could project on one screen the ballot, and so you could actually see the ballot there, and then you could see the vote tally, and people could be logging this, you know, the old-fashioned way, but it would go, I think, pretty quick. So that's what I'm recommending. There are variations on this. Some of them even are open source. So I think that that's the direction we should be going in. So in conclusion of my part, I just want to give you a few philosophical things that, you know, our laws go back to, you know, in the United States, to the philosophers like Kant and, you know, other people who were the philosophers that were read by the people in, you know, that were creating our original Constitution, and also the attorneys who create the laws and, you know, who basically adjudicate things. So looking at what Plato and Aristotle had to say, it was voting and being part of the democracy was very important to them. And as I said, again, if you don't vote, you don't count. And I'm adding to that, if you vote, there is some chance that your ballot choices may not be counted correctly. But if you don't vote, then there is 100% certainty that your opinions will not be reflected in the election outcome. So that's my conclusions of this. So basically, go and vote. Just when you're voting, forget about everything we just said and just vote anyway. But be mindful and work for change. So that's it for my portion of the talk. And then we'll go on to Peter.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's a wonderful summary of how we got to where we are. And I'm going to do a little bit of a historical view of the problems that we've been facing. My big picture view is that every stage in the election process today is a potential weak link, whether it's the registration database, whether it's the voting machines, whether it's the counting of the voting, whether it is all of the human issues that surround it, denial of services and misinformation and God knows what else that's going on. And my conclusion is that most of the problems today are refinements of old problems. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to go through some sort of a historical view of how we got to where we are. And I'll focus primarily on the computer-related risks. And I will then broaden that out and say there's a lot of stuff that is not computer-related, but that is absolutely integrity-related. So the historical view of this is something that I've cataloged in that risks-voting.pdf document that has been mentioned. It's on my website. And it goes back to roughly 1982, where there was an Indiana tabulation program that failed in midstream. It was immediately patched, I think, and then rebooted on the fly and continued to count correctly, of course, with no likelihood of any flaws. When it's patched and rebooted, you have no bet. All the bets are off, so you don't know what's happening. What really triggered me was an article, a series of 5 articles in the New York Times in 1984 by David Burnham. There was a dominant computer system company, Computer Election Systems, which is now defunct and merged probably into 3 or 4 other companies along the way. David documented a series of election fraud cases that related to this Computer Election Systems company. About the same time, May Churchill, who was actually a Penn PhD from 1957, but who had been documenting all kinds of stuff on her own relating to election problems, called on Rebecca and she called on me. And I spent an hour and a half with her in Los Angeles, and she urged me to join the fray in combating the situation that was perceived in the 1980s. My first issue of the ACM Risks Forum in 1985 included computerized elections as one of our likely problems that would be discussed in the future. And the document that I have is basically a collection of all of the items that have appeared in that in the Risks Forum and previously in the software engineering notes that I started editing in 1976. And so if we look back, then in one of the major things here was in 1988, Ronnie Duggar wrote an article in the New Yorker. And that was the time when Rebecca and I testified for the New York City Board of Education, which was chaired by Doug Kellner, who is now on the New York State Board. The thing that strikes me here, as I said, is that all of these problems that are happening today are things that have happened before in one guise or another. And it's sort of like the COVID situation where we've had the Spanish flu, and we've had various horrible coronavirus flus in the past that were in fact very damaging. And the tendency is to let that run, and then everybody says, well, it won't happen again, or it's not that important, or whatever. The same thing is relevant in the election integrity issue, because the problems that we're talking about are problems that we've known about since the early 80s, and the opportunity to fix them is always there. But basically, the election system companies have been dominant and keep insisting to election commissioners that, oh no, this is completely secure, and we've proven everything is secure. They haven't proven a thing, and typically there's no audit trail that demonstrates after the election. I think Rebecca had a case where she had a court order to examine the innards of a machine that had failed miserably. And the company said, well, you know, we have a contract with the state that nobody can look at the insides of this machine because it would diminish the security of the machine, which of course had no security and no audit trails and no ability to discover what had gone wrong. We have all these cases of vote swapping and of clicking on one screen, and there was one case in Florida in 2000 where you clicked on one candidate and for president, and it said that you have just voted for the other candidate. And the handler for the company who was providing that machine came in and said, well, you know, it's an error on the screen, but it's correct in the memory. Now, if you believe that, you're out of your mind. So the situation we have today is that we have massive denials of service. In 2003, there was an election in New Hampshire. This was the younger Sununu. And the prior case there was simply that that there was a published note of the Get Out the Vote phone number, and it was hacked by massive overloading of that phone number, which happened again in Iowa in the caucus in 2020 when they started having problems with the Democratic caucus. They published a URL which was an attempt to get help to fix the problem. That phone number was immediately jumped on by an organized or unorganized gang of people who flooded the phone lines so that that phone number became useless. So we have denials of service that have gone on for years and years and years. We have the rest home problem. I in 2000, after the election, I had a camera crew come by and interview me, and they wanted me to say that, well, this is a problem that was easily fixed, and I said, no, it's an endemic problem and it's pervasive. And they said, well, you know, we interviewed people in a rest home in Florida, which voted 100% one way. And everybody we talked to said they never even had an absentee ballot. They never applied for one. And the vote came out 100% the other way, despite they were all, I think they were all Democrats at the time. There were power failures. We had one this morning in our Princeton lab, and I think the whole Princeton area was down. There was a power failure in the Philippines in the middle of a Marcos election. And they immediately rebooted the computer and it declared the winner. That seemed rather odd since it hadn't done any of the computing. Very nice. And the power failure was only in the area of the computing facility. So that looked like a problem. So denials of service and all kinds of hanky-panky seem to be quite pervasive. My mixed metaphor, which I enjoy very much, is something that I first said back in the days of the crypto export controls, where the government was trying to put export controls on cryptography to prevent it from filtering out to other countries. And that was Pandora's cat is out of the barn and the genie won't go back in the closet. And I think that's kind of relevant here, because we have lots of research that says we might have some solutions to this problem, but they're of no interest to the commercial vendors of voting machines. So that's sort of my high-level discussion. How are we doing on time? We have, we're already 40 minutes in, so let's stop and get some questions.
Okay, I guess we can, let me pass the control back over to Diane. Diane, do you need control now, or?
I think you made me host already. We have had some questions come up. There was a question on your, from Paul Burke, have you seen any statistics concerning type 1 and 2 errors in the signature verification on absentee ballots?
We've seen a lot of cases where absentee ballots were thrown out because the signature supposedly did not match, where in fact it was a legitimate signature. You want to call that a false positive or a false negative? It's endemic in the sense that it's easy to do. There are cases where by law the two parties are supposed to, or the parties involved are supposed to have their own witnesses to the vote counting. And there are cases where both of the parties are represented by one party because nobody showed up to be a handler for the other party. So you've got two people from the same party being the witness and throwing out signatures randomly as being not what is in the log. So I think, yes, there are tons of cases of things like that.
And also there's the issue of, we're sort of alluding to this in a way too, the issue of there being like a huge majority party in an area like Philadelphia, I give as an example, that, but there's other places, of course, where it's overwhelmingly Democratic. So there are precincts, I know of one in particular, where all the people who are the poll workers, they're supposed to be Republicans and Democrats, but they're all really Democrats, but they registered as Republicans so they could be appointed as poll workers. So you always have that problem, when you have that many people who are, of a certain party, but it's also a way to shift things. We heard about the situation just in yesterday's election where a candidate was sort of overvoted by another candidate of their own party, but that could be someone from another party. So you could create a seemingly competing situation of candidates, which really is not, two candidates of the same party, one's a poser. So, and in fact, that's really true in cities where it is overwhelmingly one party. If you're registered and running as the other party, you're just not going to get elected. So that's basically what has to happen.
You're mute.
You're muted, Diana.
Sorry about that. There was a second question for Rebecca from Dave Ripley in your slide on the U.S. showing which states are getting rid of paperless systems. What are the states in green that had no designation? What's their status?
Oh, I believe that they either already had paper or, that they have it. So, so they have it available. Or that they were electronic, but they also had paper. So what Philadelphia was doing was with those machines, it's like, as you saw on that headline, it produced a paper ballot. But in fact, the voters never see that paper ballot. like a little image of it is digitized and it's put at the bottom of the screen. I didn't go in there to see that, but I know quite a few Philadelphia voters who told me that. And they couldn't even read it. There's like no way they could read it. And of course that could just be faked up. So that would be considered, there are paper ballots, but you never really saw them. So are they really paper ballots? I mean, I would exclude that, but you know, those could be, it's sort of where the vote totals are being generated. If they're being generated from the same machine that is generating the paper ballot, then there's not an independent thing. So if you took those paper ballots and either hand counted them or you could scan them, but then do we trust the scanner? But so that's, you know, those are the types of sort of crazinesses that are going on, because the places that have the electronic voting machines, they want to cling to them and not to, you know, continue to beat up on Philadelphia. I'm a native Philadelphian actually, but Philadelphia also, there was recent news that in their prior election, when they first used those machines, it was determined that some 30% of the voting machines had been misprogrammed. Oh, how convenient. So the vendor took all the machines and updated them with new software for 2020. So if they're just allowed to willy-nilly, we don't know what was in that software, what it did, or, you know, it could just be like the Philippines where, you know, it sets who the winners are. I mean, I laugh, but it's ironic. I mean, it's just so pathetic that this is what's going on. Yes, Peter.
There's one other case. A common friend of ours was in Florida during an election, I think it was 2000, where one of the ballot boxes had disappeared. And several hours later, with a rather Cheshire cat grin on her face, she came back. Oh, I just found the missing ballot box. Now, that had a seal on it, which was trivial to remove and to replace with a new seal. God knows what's happening there. Even if you have paper, there is still a problem of provenance and tracking of the chain of control of that piece of paper. That so somebody can easily mark an overvote, which disables a lot of votes. The stories in 2000 were that somebody had run a needle through entire card decks for the Republican, which essentially disabled all of the Democratic votes for a bunch of card decks. Now that kind of insider misuse is something that is very hard to control if you don't have integrity in the election of commissioner, for example. And Rebecca,
right, and
when we testified in Houston, the commissioner was totally in bed with the company and said, "Oh no, they've told us everything is perfectly secure. There's nothing that can go wrong." We didn't believe it.
Right, and the insider situation is, you know, a lot of issues arise as a result of the insider situation, where you really have people who are, again, poll workers who, you know, there was a recent conviction on this, going in and adding more votes. So they're just adding them. And since they're the poll worker, well, then the numbers are going to work out okay at the end. Oh, yeah, this number of voters voted. So nothing is really ever done about that. But that used to be with paper, it was referred to as stuffing the ballot box. So these same tricks that are done with paper, they're done electronically too. So there's nothing, you know, people were trying to make it seem as if with the electronics that would prevent this type of thing from happening. But no, it didn't. You could still play those same games and do the same tricks that people were originally doing with paper.
Next question.
So this one's actually from me. So if you were going to start up a new election for whatever reason, how much time does it require? I mean, we saw the breakdown of the Iowa caucus, and they did not have the testing required to deploy that app to, you know, do the counting in a timely manner. What is the time frame people looking for, and how long do we have systems that make it faster at this point? Or
I have my feeling about it, but I'll let Peter go first.
It's a huge process. The whole registration thing is part of this issue. all the way through to the tabulation and canvassing, final tallying, and protesting when there's a 0.01 situation that requires a recount, and then the recount is questionable. The integrity of the recount is clearly an issue. And then there's the Supreme Court when there's an appeal. So the answer to that question is that there is no general answer. It is a very elaborate process. And there are some folks in the research community who have what they believe are end solutions. The problem is those have to be embedded into this overall end-to-end situation that has things that have no computer-related aspects to ensure, for example, that the software is correct and that the hardware hasn't been compromised. You can have a perfect software solution, and I have a joint author of a paper that shows it's trivial to hack a great amount of the existing hardware.
So I agree with all of that, but I also would like to say that it goes back even further than that to the voting system standards. We call them the VSS. And these standards are not standards. They're actually just suggestions. There is no requirement by the federal government that we have standards for election equipment. And basically we have this set, they're called the VVSG, the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. So they're not even standards. But I did work for 5 years with the IEEE, who makes all sorts of really good standards, like the ones that you use for your cell phone and stuff like that. And I worked with them for 5 years with a committee, a number of people, including vendors, and it was supposed to be equally balanced. And we were never able to push for mean time between failures. That was a reasonable number that would cover election equipment being up through the entire time of the election. We were never able to set standards for paper ballots, for ballot layouts. Ultimately, these things went off to the EAC, Election Assistance Commission, who had a committee, and they were trying to, put things through there. I testified before them. I testified before the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, and there were quite a number of us, engineers, computer scientists, and we were, explaining what is wrong with the standards. So if we don't have good standards to design to, as we know, then how are you going to be able to test? How are you going to be able to certify that these things are actually working correctly?
The other aspect of that is that the elections are state issues, not federal issues in some sense. The federal government is not supposed to be dictating how the states do it. If you have a corrupt state with corrupt election officials, all bets are off again.
Correct. And it was up to the states as to whether they would adopt the VVSG. And then it had not been updated in a decade. So they're still at a loss. I mean, they're like 3 generations back. It's like use your iPhone from 2003, if there even was an iPhone.
As I said, this is all an old problem, and it's still an old problem, and it's still a new problem.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So a follow-up on that one, you said never able due to disagreement to create standards. Is that, or was it from disagreements that it was never able to create the standard, or is just there no?
It was from disagreements. Ultimately, the committee, the standards group at IEEE, I mean, we kept stonewalling it. We had enough votes that we could keep stonewalling it because we wanted these things in. I mean, if you can't have a proper mean time between failures, how can you have an engineering document? I mean, that's critical. So there were critical engineering standards that the committee refused to pass. So it basically got stonewalled. But there was an IEEE representative on the group to the Election Assistance Committee, and they weren't able to come to any terms with it either. So, so basically it got stonewalled. So it just sat there. And we were not trying to stop it. We wanted to have a good standard. I mean, mind you, I didn't spend hundreds of hours working on this project, as did many others, to have it not go through. but there were just certain things that we insisted that they're being there because those are engineering standards.
There's another question from Andy Silver, a legal question. Do you know on what basis judges have ruled that it is illegal to count all the ballots? I think this was for your slide, Rebecca.
Right. Well, in Florida, it was not really on the basis of judges. In the California case, I was actually the expert for one of the sides, but in the Michigan case and in the Florida case, what happened was when Jill Stein, she had gotten enough votes that she was eligible to ask for a recount. And so she did. She filed, and you have to pay money for this. So she filed, this was in 2016. But I had already known this. The states were sort of quietly, as quietly as you can pass a bill about elections, but they did pass bills that said that the electronic totals are the final totals of the election, not the paper ballots. So basically, this was legislated into the law. So then when she tried to, have those, the ballots, well, again, when you have the paper for it, you can't recount it, but so it's just a sham. So when she tried to have it adjudicated, the law prevailed. And so the judges in that, I believe it went to the courts and that, they were denied. Now in California, it was a very interesting case. It was a runoff election between two Republicans, and they both had the same last name, Nagoya. This was in Orange County. And so they were not related, but that's a popular last name in that ethnicity. And so it was a woman and a man, and I called it the 7 brides for 7 ballots. There were basically 7 votes on each side that were sort of, could they go one way or another? So there were like 14 votes, and they were separated by 7 votes. And so what we were trying to do was to get the entire set of ballots in that race recounted, not just these ones that were spit out by the scanner and said, I can't read this. So normally what used to happen back in the day was that ballots that could not be read by a scanner or a punch card reader or whatever, and we saw that in Bush versus Gore, they would sort of get rejected. And then those are the ones, like the guy was going with the magnifying glass to look at the chads. So that was what you would recount. And then there would be a big debate, and you would take that whole pile of ballots that were spit out by the computer, by the scanner, and you would take it to a judge, and they hold them up one at a time, and they go, okay, we think that this one, and each side says their thing. So not only that, there were numerous attorneys on each side. There was an attorney for the Orange County. There were attorneys on each side of the 2 candidates. So anything I said when I was on the stand, I object. So I could barely talk. But in any event, after, I said my piece and other people testified, the judge said, all right, we're doing the thing where we're going to look at each ballot one at a time. So they did look at each ballot one at a time. And if it looked to be in favor of the girl, they accepted it. And if it looked in favor of the guy, they rejected it. So it was like boom, boom, boom. So that was basically how it was decided. It was decided by the judge on the basis. They never would do what we wanted was the full recount, so we could check everything to see if anything else. In that ballot that I showed you, in the one from Florida, that 60 Minutes has sent me, there were 3 races. It's a very interesting ballot. There were 3 races where someone put an X through both candidates, meaning they didn't want to vote for either in some of the smaller races. But the thing is that in one of the X's, it sort of leaked over into the voting box. And so that was not necessarily counted. We don't know how it was counted. We don't know how the scanner decides. And last fall, this was also a runoff election. This was for a district attorney's race in New York, not in New York City, but further into the state. And this was a runoff. So it was the top 2 vote getters that were having this runoff election. And there, again, ballots were rejected and by the computer, because it can't tell, like if you circle the name or circle the box, or put an X in it where you're supposed to put a dot, So there's many ways that you have to follow the rules. So it's really important to follow the rules when you're doing a paper ballot. But what happened was a number of these got rejected. And what we wanted was, again, a full recount, because as it turns out, these scanners that are scanning the paper ballots are not following the state election rules. The state election rules may allow for a circle, like as we saw in Orange County, the judge can decide, okay, this looks like it was for, the woman, this looks like it was for the guy. So whatever, you have these ambiguities. And so it's really critical. It's not artificial intelligence of ballot scanning. It's like, these are the ones that have the dot colored in, and these are the ones that we can't read, but they would, if you're using maybe artificial intelligence, be able to figure out, or we can look at it and say, this is how it's supposed to be decided. But the problem is that this is not in the code. I don't know of any system that actually accounts for all of this type of anomalous stuff. And that's why I say the idea of, looking at them one by one on the night of the election before they moved out of the room would be a good thing, because everybody sees it. You can record it on your camera, and you could broadcast them on social media, as everybody is doing nowadays. So I see that as a direction we should be going in.
Oh, we needed to wrap up. So are there a couple final thoughts and before we go?
There's lots more to be said, but this is just sort of a beginning.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that. So, I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. This is really valuable.
Yeah, I want to thank you both for coming and joining us at BCI. To the attendees out there, we will have office hours next week where you can come and ask further questions. And our next webinar will be in 2 weeks, and it'll be on computer security and contact tracing. So I think it'll be a very interesting topic.
I have one quick comment. I knew Becky very well. I've served on committees with her, and we did a classified study once that was devastating to the commissioner of that study. She was an extraordinary person, and I loved her dearly, and I miss her, and I'm really happy that you guys are continuing in her memory.
Peter, thank you. And Becky, when she was alive, spoke similarly about you.
Well, I'm happy to know that.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.